Hello, hello.
Hello. All right. My apologies. I know we had talked last week about me putting together agendas for these meetings, but I actually did not do it for this week. I plan is to get on it for the next meeting. I will.
I just didn't want to go stomping across things, because it is unkind to have somebody say, "Oh, I'll go do this," and then you go do it instead. That
Yeah.
just I try and avoid that. It's all sortable.
Excellent. Also, I unfortunately will have to leave halfway through today's meeting, so I don't think I don't think that I should be the person to share my screen because then we would just lose it partway through.
That is a perfectly reasonable position to have about the world. Okay, let me go ahead and stick the link in the chat if folks want to go add themselves to the attendees list. I will go ahead and pardon me. Get things queued up here. So, is there anyone else who would like to run the meeting today, or shall I? I'm fine either way.
I think it's all you.
Okay, then let me go ahead and share. Let me go ahead and reclaim the hostness. And then I'll share. Excellent. Can everyone see my screen?
Yeah, I can.
All right, and it's 5 after, so we should probably get moving. All right then. So in terms of reviewing standing topics, we have the CFP tracking spreadsheet. Do we have any updates for this from folks?
No update from me, although I do think because the deadline for RustConf is coming up. I mean, it's later this month, and I don't want to be surprised by it. It's just over 2 weeks away. So I want to put some more time in this week to further fleshing out the notes that Ashley and I are working off of into something that's actually like in a submittable format.
Yeah, no, that's a good plan. I know I always find when I'm collaborating with someone, my normal proclivity of doing it 2 hours before the deadline is usually not the best move. So excellent. Anything else on this that folks are aware that we need to update? All right then. Languages and tool outreach. Do we have anything that folks would like to update here?
Is there, considering Open Source Summit is coming up and some of us will be there, we should also check to see if there's any opportunities there.
Or at least to get everyone together, around tasty beverages. I sadly will not be there, but I know that a lot of other folks will. Does someone want to take point on organizing the get together there? Would you be willing to do that, Frederick? We could be there.
Let me start by taking ownership of it. I may have to hand it off to someone else, but tentatively we'll say yes for now.
All right, that sounds good.
Just to get a sense, whomst among us will actually be in town? Obviously myself and Frederick. Anybody else?
Where is it being held?
Seattle.
I would not be surprised to discover that Chris Short is going to be there, but I don't think he's here today.
David, was that a nod that you'll be in town or just an acknowledgement?
It was an acknowledgement that it was 2,700 miles away.
Yes. Fair enough.
Yeah,
Andrew,
Ava,
you're not coming?
no, I won't be able to be there. I was about to say, Ava, I think you're at an advantage because you're in Seattle already, right?
Yes, close enough.
Yeah.
Modulo various motorcycling adventures.
Exactly.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Modulo a short ride. Yeah. Okay, well, it might just be 2 or 3 of us. That's still lovely.
And what's the date again?
Next week.
Yeah, okay, that's not gonna happen.
Well, the invitation is always open if you change your mind.
Okay. I mean, it would actually be totally awesome to see both Frederick and Ava like in real life. That'd be very cool. But I think that will have to happen at another point.
We have met in real life in the past, but it was a different world, a different time.
Okay, I am at a loss.
Well, I ran the Scala meetups
Oh, right.
out here.
Yeah. We talked about that. Yeah. Okay. So we did know each other back in the San Francisco Scala thing.
A long, long time ago, I can still remember when.
This is how our YouTube videos get DMCA takedown.
See, if you had shut off your video, it may have been okay, but the synchronization licenses are a thing.
Now I'm just going to be ruined for the rest of the day thinking all type related lines to American Pie.
Yep.
You've ruined me. Ruined me.
Yep, the mind worm has been planted. All right,
Well,
so do we have anything from folks on POC demos or questions from implementers for today?
I will just say for me, I've put a little bit more time last week into the input manifest implementation. In particular, trying to work out kind of the a nice API for handling embedding versus non-embedding mode and kind of how I want that flow to work. I think based on prior conversations, we had some discussion around the fact that there's a need to kind of, you have the creation of the artifact and the creation of the manifest, and then the artifact, basically, if you're doing embedding, needs to be updated with the reference to the manifest, and then you produce the identifier for the artifact. So there's sort of a flow there that ideally I'd like the API to just sort of do for you correctly, rather than requiring users of it to make sure that they get the steps in the right order. So, working out what's a nice way for that to happen.
One thing I do want to check in on a little bit with this, and this is mostly coming from a place of ignorance on my part. So if I say something silly, forgive me. But my understanding was that the Rust compiler was using LLVM in order to output things like backends. And I vaguely recall, Barathi, that when you had been doing your work for LLVM, you basically had things set up for an ELF backend that just presumed that certain information had been provided by the front end. And so long as that information was there from the front end, it would go and do the thing.
Yeah,
Is that correct?
That's right.
I don't know, because I know there's like a little bit of strangeness about how Rust is using LLVM. I don't know how that interacts with what you're doing, Andrew, but I wanted to make sure.
I think the thing is that the goal of what I'm trying to write here is that it's a generic way for anyone that wants to integrate, to do OmniBOR in their tools, to integrate everything, for them to do that. So I don't I have to sort of build it de novo rather than relying on and build it to be as a standalone thing rather than relying on LLVM stuff.
You're providing generically usable libraries.
Yep.
So if somebody wanted to go and do something with them in Rust that they could bind into Python, or Ruby or whatever, that would be a doable thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah. So for LLVM, as long as you are using the LLVM's LLD linker, then and if you have any OmniBOR sections embedded in the inputs, then it will be automatically created in the final ELF object file as well. So as long as LLD is being used for the purpose of linking ELF objects, then that is taken care of.
Okay, cool. All right, anything else on POC demos and questions from implementers? All right then, moving on. Adopting the antitrust policy for meetings. So basically, we now have a bunch of folks from a bunch of different corporate entities, including various startups, coming together here, and things are getting a bit more serious. And it's probably best for all of us to avoid antitrust issues. And the Linux Foundation has a fairly well-worn, everyone's sort of accustomed to it, antitrust policy that it's probably a good idea for us to simply adopt and call a call out at the beginning of our meetings that we're operating under it. What I would suggest that we do, if it's okay with folks, is point folks towards it to review offline, because reviewing such documents inline can be very time consuming, and check back next week to see if everyone is comfortable with it. And if so, we can just stick at the top that, we're here operating under this antitrust policy.
Yeah, what I will just add to that is that the overall sense of the policy is pretty much it sets things to not discuss, which would be basically things that would get you in potential antitrust trouble for discussing, to get into like company specifics and financials and plans and stuff, and basically says, hey, like we avoid those things in these meetings, everyone's sort of happy, and you avoid legal risks for different participants involved. But yeah, absolutely read the thing in detail, and yeah, I think coming back next week makes sense.
Can I be a lawyer for a minute?
Well, as long as you're not our lawyer.
I am nobody's. I am just going to speak a little bit of like, okay, there's a bootstrapping issue here, which is we don't yet have a governance model for the community. So how can the community adopt an antitrust policy without a governance model?
I have also noticed this chicken and egg situation.
Yeah, and the I understand the chicken and egg situation. That's actually part of why we've got the foundation selection stuff in terms of finding meetings for that, coming up next.
You start governance in the same way you start HOAs in established neighborhoods. You get everyone to agree.
Yep. David, I don't hear you I don't hear you objecting, just sort of asking, how do we do it? How do we, who actually has to, I don't know, vote?
Well,
Is that
it? I'm not objecting at all. I think it's absolutely a fantastic idea. But this is, who does it apply to if there is not a formal HOA?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So I think maybe what we do is just we come to an agreement or don't next time. And at the beginning of each meeting, until we have a formal governance model, we simply state this meeting is being,
Yes.
That way we're showing good effort. We're showing, that we're trying to move forward without basically what it becomes is effectively an ad hoc vote or an ad hoc agreement in every meeting until there's a governance model, at which point we no longer have to do the ad hoc thing.
I would, I think that's fine. There is a little bit in terms of what's the actual, what formality currently exists other than who shows up to meetings. The GitHub org and the projects underneath that org do have defined membership, right? And so that's the closest proxy we have right now to that. But I don't think that we have to go do any diligence on that because what we're talking about right here is for the scope of this meeting. The meeting, we're all agreeing to abide by this policy. And I think it's a good idea to introduce that at the beginning of each meeting so that the meeting itself is occurring with everyone aware of this policy.
Yep. And for any fans of old for any fans of the court jester, the old film, we can all get together at the beginning and say, "Yay, verily yay."
Yeah.
The mental model that comes to mind is a murmuration of birds. We all walk in the same direction.
We're all kind of flying in a similar direction here. I guess I'll be explicit and open the floor. Does anyone, other than the sort of process question that David raised, is anyone concerned about the direction? Is the murmuration of birds going in a direction that you don't want to fly in? Would love to hear from you.
Yeah, I'm pretty comfortable overall. I've operated repeatedly and habitually under this antitrust policy. So
Wonderful.
All right. Foundation selection meeting. There is a doodle poll out. It's just in case there's some confusion. Doodle doesn't deal with days of the week very well. It just deals with dates. So I've thrown the week way out into the future. Please read it as days of the week, not as specific dates in May, because obviously we want to get this resolved well before then. And so if you have not yet answered the doodle poll, and you are interested in being part of the foundation selection meetings, please do. Is there anything else that folks would like to discuss around this before we move on? Okay. So we had this item here, I think that's associated with you, Dave, about GitOID versus plain SHA-256.
Yeah. So I've been working through a lot of kind of building and modeling the corpus, which I think we collectively understand, and even in the CISA paper, there is, kind of the database. One of the things that I came across as I've been starting to model things is there are different communities that use different hashes. So it's very likely that we will need to supply multiple hashes for each thing anyway. And as I started pulling on that thread, I started asking the question, I understand the original intent of the GitOID, which is to reduce the amount of computation required and also required to associate the source in a Git repository, and also be able to query Git repositories for some thing that existed in the past. Because basically the indexing mechanism that Git uses is a GitOID. But as we seem to be moving away from just the pure association of source files and a resulting binary into these collections of packages, it's feeling like the original value of using GitOIDs is reduced. Intersecting that with the choice of SHA-256 GitOIDs, which, until a Git repository is updated from SHA-1 or SHA-1 DC to SHA-256, we lose the benefit anyway. It's feeling more and more like just simply SHA-256 is a good identifier. It also becomes something that's simpler for somebody to say, is this on my machine? Because there are, more tools available to calculate checksum or, hashes. And those tools are typically available in almost every version of Linux and some other operating systems. I mean, I haven't checked BusyBox to see whether it has SHA-256 sum built in, but I'm guessing that it's at least got MD5 built in. And so for those reasons, I want to revisit the choice of GitOID versus a plain SHA-256. And by the way, just one other thing, as I'm building out the corpus, there will be aliases between the different hashes and an item. So there, I'm going to calculate, for everything that I'm ingesting. And when I say that I'm the one that's doing the work right now. I'm expecting this will become more of a community effort over time. But, seeding the community with, hey, if you find a hash, we can give you information about this.
Yeah, so this actually comes back to something that I I was wanting to do, not so much today, but shortly, which is coming back to the whole dropping the GitOID SHA-1 bit discussion that was had. I managed to, and this is purely my own fault, not be here for that discussion. And I think that there was a bit of commingling that went into that between what build tools are doing and what indexing is doing, if that makes sense. Because I think there is some distinction there that is potentially quite interesting and important. As to the broadening the hashes being used for various things, like I think we sort of intentionally left space to be able to do things of that nature. And so, yeah. So I mean, I guess the point I'm making is I'm sort of over supportive of this, and that I'd like to actually broaden the conversation a bit more. And I'd actually like to to bring in the distinction between what the build tools are doing versus what an indexer is doing, because I think there's a much stronger argument for an indexer saying, look, I'm past the source code level to begin with on most of these things, and so maybe I make a different choice. Does that make sense? I mean, the other thing that strikes me is that when you're talking about different hashes, mostly you're dealing with two sets of costs. The first cost, well, I don't think the hash itself, multiple hashes themselves are that expensive, because reading the file in is the expensive part, not the computing the hash. And then you get the question of the cost of storing the result, which I think is a more debatable cost. Does that make sense?
I think there's a third cost, which is what is indexed. And in other words, if you have to build the index across multiple hashes rather than an alias, that changes the indexing cost.
So I don't want to rat hole on this right now. But at some point I'd like to understand that, because when I think about the indexing cost, I think about the cost of computing the hashes and the cost of storing the hashes. And there, I would be open to the fact that there may be other costs that I am not seeing, but those are there's a missing cost that I'm not seeing there that I think you are.
So it's the cost of the edges between the nodes. So if if you basically have different hashes representing different edges, it increases the complexity, or it increases the number of edges in the graph.
Okay. Can we schedule a nice chunk of time for this, maybe in next week's meeting, and have folks come prepared to talk about it? Does that sound good to folks?
Let's do that. Well, next week's meeting overlaps with
Oh yes, we're gonna have a lot.
Summit, so I will not be able to make it. I think Frederick also will not be able to make it.
I
The
would
week
rather
after that.
not have this discussion in a room where various people are precluded by.
Yeah, I would like to highlight. Ed, you talk about the two types of costs, generating and storing. Related to storing is searching, right? Indexing the index. Given a known hash, where is this? That challenge is also computationally more expensive the larger the hash value structure is. And one of the use cases we've all discussed for the past couple of years is using these artifact dependency graphs to efficiently locate the prevalence of known vulnerable code.
Yep.
So searching to me is the primary use case that all of it enables.
Yeah, and the searching costs are going to vary somewhat depending on how optimized the method you're using for searching is.
Yeah.
Because if you're doing something that's relatively simple but not super performant, like the file system structure, you know, in order to traverse these things, you know, the additional hashes don't add a much additional cost to that method, but it's also a very primitive method. So, you know, I don't want to consider it entirely dispositive, but that's definitely a thing to add to the things to consider. So,
David, just to make sure I followed you, you're not proposing to remove support for multiple hash formats for sort of the, you know, forward adaptability if we need to replace a format in the future, correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
And you know, the mechanism that I've been starting to work on is effectively, and this is stealing from Andrew, or he was the one that proposed the phrase of alias. So
Gotcha.
having multiple aliases, you know, each different hash becomes a different alias for the same thing. The question is, what's the primary key of the thing?
Right.
Should the primary key be GitOID? Should the primary key be SHA-256, or should the primary
Yeah, David, that sounds like a very much an internal implementation detail that different you know, providers of data stores around this might choose a different way of indexing in that sense. It doesn't affect the protocol, doesn't affect the spec.
Well, the place that it does impact things is, do I have to download a separate tool on my local machine in order to start traversing a graph? And with the aliases, the answer is probably no, because you can alias from a SHA-256 into the thing and then start traversing from the thing.
Yeah, let's very much.
It's so
this is the first time I've come across the concept of aliasing in one of our weekly meetings. So let's definitely, I don't know, if come back to that. I noticed Andrew just dropped.
yeah,
So I can understand that a little more, and I don't. It sounds like it's outside of the scope of the spec, or I missed a whole bunch of discussions.
yeah. So let's good.
Let me put together some like actual running code to demonstrate.
Yeah,
that might.
This is part of why I was suggesting that we should probably, you know, having teed this up, we should probably schedule it out. It looks like probably 2 weeks hence and not next week, because it's a conversation I'd like to have maximum available participation for. And effectively what I think you're discovering is there are things you could productively prepare for the conversation, Dave. And I know I absolutely have some work to do to productively prepare for the conversation. And so by sort of sticking it a couple of weeks out, then we can make sure that we actually give it the time that it's due.
So maybe the thing that we do offline, in addition to preparing, is work on a Merkle tree spec. In other words, how are we going to compute the Merkle trees? Because I think that's also going to inform things.
Okay, no, that's absolutely fine. So I've taken a note here. We're intending to have a deeper conversation on this Monday, April 22nd. I do want to kind of throw one thing out there, since we're going to have quite several people who are out next Monday. Do we want to meet next Monday, given the large number of absences?
I'm fine. Monday 10 a.m. works fine for me.
Okay.
Also, For those who are interested, I know this is a little bit of a deviation, but I think 8 a.m. is the first FBOM CISA meeting as well on the same day. And so just want to make sure people have that on their radar as well.
Good to know. All right, then. Anything else on this topic before April 22nd? All right, input manifest. So we had a discussion around the targeting input manifest. I think this ended up being somewhat related to the sort of non-embedding approach stuff, right? Like, how do you figure out, given an input manifest, what is it an input manifest for? You know, how to associate an artifact ID with its manifest ID. And I had put together some thoughts on this before for a non-embedding approach. And there were some of the things that people had called out where the manifest ID is in fact the hash of the manifest. And that's straightforward if you're embedding it in the artifact itself. And then how do we get this metadata for historical artifacts? So I guess the question is there a thread in this discussion that people would like to pull first? Or do we want to jump into the thing that I suggested previously on not embedding, which, by the way, is not a fully baked thing. It's just a sort of an idea in that direction. All right, then. Jumping in, the basic proposal that I sort of made was you could effectively represent the association between an artifact ID and its manifest ID by simply writing out a single data entry manifest file. And dropping it as something in the output directory that you had with the output artifact had been, I think, the original idea. There were a fair number of other discussions about how other ways you might handle the mapping. You might instead put it into a mapping directory to map between the artifact ID, the output artifact IDs, and carrying these files with them that tells you the mapping to their input manifest. Is this making sense to folks?
I think instead of storing it along with the output artifact, that would mean, we have to pick these files which could be spread, all over the workspace, right? That may not be. Not sure if that's.
I think that's why the subsequent suggestion for
A
that.
central location, just as like how we store the OmniBOR.
Yep, and you can then just go pull out
the different
by the
subdivisions.
artifact ID. Yep, you can just go pull out by the artifact ID.
Yeah, and having it named as the output artifact ID would help establish the mapping. That's the way metadata is also done. So it's the.
Yep.
I mean, another point in consideration is depending on what goes into metadata, there could just be one file which contains all the information that's required to generate the input manifest and the metadata, because it's just that's how the BOR message implementation is today, it's. Yeah, so and the LLVM and GCC implementations also supported because we wanted to be compatible with the existing BOR message. So essentially, the non-embedding mode, what it would entail is just passing an option or setting an environment variable to indicate that we would not be embedding the node.omnibor sections in the ELF. and it would leave everything else the same, which is when we create the metadata, we have the
Right.
name of the
But
dependencies and all that.
with BOM.sh, we currently have a whole wide assortment of metadata in a fairly complicated JSON format.
Oh,
That's
no. What I meant by metadata is the tool generating the metadata. So there is a file under OmniBOR, under omniBOR/metadata subdirectory. We create a file, and that is the information that BOM.sh uses for processing today. And it basically contains the names of the dependencies, because that's part of the metadata, to have the, instead of just hash names, associating it with the file name so that it's human readable as well. So it basically contains all the contents of the input manifest, including the names of the file. So it has the hash and it has the names of the file, name of the file corresponding to the hash as well, which is what forms the contents of the input manifest as well. So if you have this information, then an external tool can easily generate the input manifest.
No, absolutely. I mean, it does.
Or it has to be generated as a separate.
It is slightly leaky though, in that it leaks information about the file names and the directory structure.
That's right.
That you may not wish to pass on to a downstream consumer.
Yeah. So in that case, a centralized location with under OmniBOR / some suitable name, and where we just dump the contents of the IM that we generate today would suffice.
So Dave, you've got a bunch of dirt under your fingernails right now. Do you have thoughts?
My thought is, whatever the format is, we'll ultimately ingest it. The key thing is, can we do an attestation of this? Because what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to attest to the fact that this is a correct statement. In other words, that, and this is, if you're thinking about, is there a supply chain attack, you want to be able to say, okay, this was the Git version that was checked out. This was the hash, whatever that hash may be, of the source files that were used to compile the thing. And here's an attestation of that. Can we then go back and do random audits to say, okay, we're going to check out the version from Git. We're going to look at what the attestation said. Do they tie? Now, Ed, this gets back to the issue that you raised with how some embedded systems do things, where there's a checkout, then there's a munging of the source file. In other words, there's a patch applied to the source file, which is going to further complicate things. But from the corpus perspective, which is, I think, the question that you were asking, if we can sit down and we can say, there's an attestation, we will then accept the various different output manifests and associated metadata. We will roll those into the graph, whether that's creation of new nodes or association with existing nodes. So association with existing node, you have the same source file used to compile 50 different binaries across 20 different systems. Okay, that's going to be a very common thing to do. The corpus is going to be able to allow you to say, from the source file, what was generated. What we want to be able to do with that data is ensure that it's attested to and have a mechanism for auditing.
So if only we had someone on the call who did a lot of stuff with attestations.
Really? Would Frederick be around?
I am. And I'm listening to a lot of stuff, and I really should speak up a little bit more. Yeah, so part of where some of this stuff is captured, especially what you were mentioning about with Git. So there's several organizations that are starting to move towards what they call salsa attestations. So if you look at like NPM, There's something that's going on in both the Python and Ruby communities as well. I need to look in to see exactly what the form is, but it's based on the update framework, Tough. But the primary advantage that these newer techniques, irrespective of what format they actually choose, is that the signing is done by a third party, and that signing also includes what the repo was that it pulled from, including the commit, and also includes the artifacts that were generated as part of that, which then gives linkage for where did something come from and what did it end up emitting. NPM has already implemented this, and my understanding is it's already in production, and you can use it with NPM verify. So and that ends up covering a I don't want to say a gap, but it covers an orthogonal problem that is useful for solving the type of problems that I believe we in this community are trying to solve. So anyways, that's the story in a nutshell.
Okay, so this, I think, at a technical level, I'm feeling okay. At a what is OmniBOR good for, which is something that it's a document that we're still working on. In other words, what are the business benefits? I'm not sure we've tied all of the business benefits back to the file format and the contents. Mm-hmm. So my take on it is a cautious yes, or a cautious this sounds good to me, but we should once we finish the what are the business benefits, or I shouldn't say business benefits, but what are the operational benefits of OmniBOR. Once we finish that document, we should go back and make sure that everything that's in the file format ties back to some benefit. And if there's a benefit that doesn't have a tie back, we then enhance the file format to include that. Does that sound like a
Yeah, no, that absolutely does. And I think, you know, in this regard, what we're really looking at is if we're in the case where you are not embedding for whatever reason, can we actually figure out how to map an artifact to an input manifest? Which is essentially saying, do you understand, if you can't simply look inside the artifact for the thing, and instead you're outside, you're making this graph from outside the artifact, how do you document the graph? And I think from what Frederick was saying, we could effectively treat all the input manifests, including this mapping file, among the output artifacts of your build process that are being signed. At which point what you have is an attestation, which I presume is coming as a unit, that it says all these things were attested together at the same time. The artifact, the mapping file, the input manifests, all the way down the line.
So in that case, go ahead.
And to take it a step further, the thing that I'm hoping that we could get to, which is why I was looking towards the GitOID approach, or not the GitOID, but the OmniBOR approach. It's that I would love for eventually the compilers themselves to pick up, which is like, of course, and we all know this, but like we get the compilers to pick this up so that we can literally do a scan of, or a hash of any given artifact. And then we can look at the history of that particular thing and tie it to its inputs, and also do the exact opposite, to take the inputs and tie them back to their outputs. That gives us a path towards, like, to say that we discover that there's a particular library that has, and in C, this would be a good example, where there's a specific library that maybe it does tree operations, and we discover there's a security flaw in it. And very often people will just copy and paste directories that include that. And the question is, how do we know where that thing ended up? Of course, we can't catch 100% of the things, because they change even just one bit, then of course the hashes don't match anymore. But the number of things that literally just get copied and pasted and then used is quite high. So we'd be able to catch things like that. But really the primary thing is getting that inventory to be able to say, this thing here ended up landing in these particular artifacts, and then these artifacts ended up running in these particular locations, and building that inventory of what is running where in a much more holistic way.
Yep. Cool. All right. So
Actually, let me toss one other piece into this, which is if there's going to be a common corpus, we also will ultimately need to understand what the admission criteria is for the corpus. In other words, what is the criteria for accepting kind of a collection of manifests?
So let me suggest, and I may be completely insane here, but let me suggest flipping that the other direction. Because you're thinking about admissions criteria to the corpus, and one other way to think about it is what are the filtering criteria on the corpus for the subportion of the corpus that you actually want your query to run across?
That's true. I am just trying to figure out and do some threat modeling on how could somebody poison the corpus? In other words, how could they make submissions to the corpus that would cause something to happen that we don't want to? And I have not fully threat modeled that yet.
Yeah, and I'm also kind of thinking a little bit in terms of potentially being at a place where you have a tree of corpuses over time, where like Google publishes their corpus and Microsoft publishes their corpus and Cisco publishes their corpus, and you'd like to be able to draw across those corpi, and then somebody sort of shows up and says, yeah, and for this kind of thing we've got this weird guy in the corner doing his own corpus, and I don't know that we really want to take everything he gives us, but for this corner of the problem space we probably do. Because there's going to be like the one thing we can absolutely guarantee about all of this is we're going to have weird corner cases. Okay, so let me take as an action item then for this, writing up something that's a little more formal, because basically the thing we've been talking through has just been sort of throwing shit at the wall, and it's enough to have a conversation, but and this probably is something that we would want to do on or after April 22nd. I put it lower down than talking about this stuff that we booked on April 22nd. But that sort of puts something time boxed around it, if that makes sense.
If I may jump in with a sort of broader question, since I know I've missed several meetings, it's quite possible I missed this detail. Conversation about the corpus database. I see that phrase appear a few times in the notes and conversation. What exactly is this, since it's not part of the spec?
So it is the bidirectional indexed relationship among everything that I found on Maven Central, and I'm starting to work on everything I can find in Docker Hub.
Okay, I think it may be a good topic for a future meeting. I can't dive into it right now, and we're getting close to the end, as to whether implementations of databases storing and indexing sort of ecosystem specific or company specific graphs is something we want to discuss in these meetings or not.
Okay.
If Joe's Crab Shack happens to produce a lot of software or use a lot of software and internally wants to maintain a database that they could cross-reference if a public notice somewhere says, hey, this hash is bad, look at your systems if you have it, that sort of an internal database probably has very different properties and parameters and risks and threats and trust models than a public database. If, say, GitHub, which has all of this Git data, were to publish or provide a similar corpus around all of the projects hosted on GitHub public. Again, ditto, same problem statement for a GitHub Enterprise instance might have a different set of trust and risk and threat models for that organization's internal use. So I think that conversation is going to veer pretty quickly and away from the spec and much more into corporate usage and differences there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, there's a fine line on all that stuff, including the fact that even if we don't necessarily want to include some of that stuff in what we're discussing in OmniBOR proper, we do want to make sure that we've got the right points of flexibility to enable those sorts of things.
Of course.
And so, yeah, I mean, it continues to be an interesting line in conversation. Okay. So, anything else on the input manifest topic here that we want to discuss today? Okay, anything else that we want to discuss today in general? All right, I'm inclined then to yield back the time. And I will see some of you next week and some of you the week after.
I just want, sorry for.
Oh, please.
I just wanted to check on one quick thing on the YouTube updates. Last, I think, couple of weeks, I have been lagging behind. I have not posted the recordings, which I plan to by the end of this week. So my question was, do we need to, is there a benefit to uploading all of this? Because when I look at the number of views, it's just probably just me trying to check if it's uploaded properly, and it's just 1 or 2 views. But if there is or should we just do only for the ones where we have demos? Because I think that's when I see that there is more than 1 or 2 views. Because otherwise, or is this for some purpose that for documentation and such that we are doing this?
So you wanted to say something, Dave?
Yeah, I think this goes into the provenance of the project and the public provenance of the project. So we are now exploring having certain antitrust things. We're exploring governance and other factors. I think having a very public record, even if nobody is currently looking at that public record, having a public record of where OmniBOR came from, I think has a lot of value. Okay. Yeah, it's just like if you go to City Hall, it's unlikely that anybody has ever looked at your property records except when you bought or sold a house. But everybody knows they're there. And that public visibility has a lot of power. And having the public notes, having the public meetings, having all of these things be public has the power of demonstrating that we've been of the provenance of OmniBOR.
Okay.
Or I should say the neutral provenance of OmniBOR.
So here's actually a suggestion I would make, because we are running down a little bit on time, which is probably not next week because we have a lot of folks absent. But if you could add this to the agenda going forward after next week as something we can work in for discussion. Because part of what I'm hearing is you're actually doing work about getting those up, which is appreciated. You're wondering whether that work is worthwhile. And that's a perfectly valid thing to be wondering. And so Dave has raised a good point on the public provenance, but I also don't want to shortchange you getting a broader answer on this, if that makes sense.
So let me make a suggestion that may solve both problems. We do get the, or what's the cost of downloading just kind of the Zoom file? kind of the whatever Zoom produces. If we simply archive that out to a public place, that would satisfy my goals without having to go through the efforts of uploading it to YouTube.
I think there's a longer conversation there, because I think YouTube brings, in terms of accessibility, brings substantial value compared to simply dropping an MP4 file somewhere. So, but let's definitely make sure that we do follow up with that on a broader conversation. Does that sound good to you, Bharati?
Yes, that sounds good. I was just wondering, yeah, if it makes sense to record only demo. I'm not, yeah, if there is value, I'm open to doing it. I just
think,
feel sometimes it's just more clutter or something.
I think there's a very definitive maybe at this stage. But everything has to be weighed, and that has to be weighed against the effort that it requires from you to go and do so. And I don't want to discount that either.
Okay. I'll just add a note to the agenda item. And
yep. All right. Excellent. See you all here subsequently.